Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I want to talk about why successful gay male professionals still feel off and what actually changes it. Most of the men I work with don't come in because something's wrong. They come in because something isn't working as well as it should, given how capable they are in every other area of life. You're successful, you've built a career that works. But something in your life still feels off. And at a certain point, you start realizing it's not fixing itself. Your relationships don't quite hold the way they should. Your downtime doesn't feel as restorative as you expected. And there isn't the same sense of ease outside of your work that you assumed would come with everything you've built. Not broken and not falling apart, but just not where it should be, especially when it comes to relationships, connection, intimacy, or a sense of emotional ease. And for many men, this isn't new. It's something they've been noticing quietly for years and not seeing change. At this point in my life, I think I'm not writing as an observer looking in. I'm writing as someone who's in it, a later career, late midlife professional myself, who has spent over 34 years working closely with gay men as both a psychotherapist and coach for individuals and couples and occasionally polycules. My practice is based from my home office in West Hollywood, part of Los Angeles, and I work with clients throughout California, a state that is in many ways one of the most competitive and psychologically demanding professional environments in the country. It's high stakes. We have higher gas prices. We have a higher cost of living. We have more population density. LA especially is very competitive with like New York City in terms of being urban competitive environments with lots of professionals in them that I call high demand, high reward occupations. So it's not a casual ecosystem. California attracts and produces people who are highly trained, highly driven, and often operating at an elite level. The bar exam is more difficult than in many other states. Clinical licensure requirements are rigorous. The economy is full of opportunity, but it's also relentless in its expectations, especially in places like Hollywood, the film and TV industry. So you're not just trying to succeed, you're trying to succeed in a landscape where many others are equally capable, equally ambitious, and equally accomplished. I mean, there's the whole area of Hollywood, in entertainment, in San Diego, with some of the military presence, certainly in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, and then, of course, everyone in other cities. It's a very populous state. So all this reality shapes people, and it shows up in ways that most guys don't fully recognize. So if you're hearing this as someone in one of these environments, you already feel that, of course. But what I've seen over and over again across, like I said, more than 3 decades of work with gay men, is that each profession has its own built-in stressors, and those stressors don't exist in a vacuum. They don't stay contained to your job. They shape how you think and relate and respond everywhere else, what I call the worldview. A physician is going to have a different worldview from an attorney, from a creative professional, and so on. And it's not just in theory. It's how you think and about others and yourself, how you relate to others, and how you carry stress day to day. Over the years, I've worked with a very specific cross-section of gay male professionals within that environment. Physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and medical specialists working inside a hierarchical, high-stakes healthcare delivery system. Or attorneys, litigators, other legal professionals operating in an adversarial, high-pressure environment. I've worked with attorneys, and I've also worked with clients who are currently in legal processes, and they're certainly high-pressure environments. Teachers, professors, academic leaders navigating increasing scrutiny, right? In the Trump era, there's a scrutiny about no DEI, no this, no that. And anybody wanting federal funding for a grant that has the words LGBT in it will be automatically disqualified. It's really an intense scrutiny with the far right government. There's blurred boundaries. There can be cultural conflict, in education. I hear a lot from professors and teachers, not just about the academia, but also about the culture, about what you can and cannot say, generational issues. They're more frustrated by that than they are with student performance academically. There's corporate executives, entrepreneurs. I've worked with a lot of the gay male solo entrepreneur and startup founders managing things like risk and competition and constant performance pressure. Creative professionals, certainly in and around LA, writers, directors, actors, where identity and image and career are often inseparable. So each of these professions comes with classic, well-known demands. But what is much less discussed and far less understood is what happens when those demands are filtered through the lived experience of being a gay man specifically. Because that doesn't just add stress, it changes the equation. It can mean navigating professional environments that are still, in many ways, implicitly heteronormative. It's a little more subtle now because discrimination laws protect outright homophobia or discrimination based on homophobia, but they're still implicitly heteronormative in lots of ways you probably know of. It can mean managing visibility and self-presentation and boundaries in a way that straight colleagues often don't have to think about. That's part of straight privilege, is that we have to think of things other people don't and navigate certain challenges that straight people don't. It can mean carrying aspects of identity and history or relational development that were delayed or interrupted or shaped differently as we grew up as gay men. Experiencing professional stress that is compounded but not always recognized or validated by others. So the issue is not simply your job is stressful. The issue is this: you're dealing with the inherent pressures of your profession and an additional invisible layer that complicates how you experience and process and respond to those pressures. Because I can tell you this directly because I've seen it hundreds of times. When that second layer is not addressed, it does not resolve on its own, and it tends to quietly get more entrenched. It's a stress that happens in the background. And what tends to happen instead is more subtle and more persistent. Men continue to perform at a high level professionally. They continue to meet what's expected of them. They continue to function, but internally something starts to shift and not in a direction you want. They begin to experience a growing sense that their life doesn't feel as connected or satisfying as it should, despite everything working on paper. A difficulty sustaining a satisfying relationship. A stress that doesn't ever fully resolve even when circumstances improve. Patterns that repeat even when they understand them. Not because they lack insight, but because the interaction between professional demands and personal identity hasn't been fully worked through in a structured and deliberate way. I've kind of spoken about this before. My episode on gay men and how not to die alone addresses some of these patterns about showing up in dating and long-term connection. You might want to hear that episode too. But this is typically the moment where insight stops being enough and staying the same starts to feel more expensive. So, hey, if you're recognizing yourself here, this is usually the point where guys reach out, not because they're falling apart, but because they don't want to spend another 5 or 10 years staying exactly the same. So remember, you can always call or text 310-339-5778 or email me, ken@gaytherapyla.com. Let's talk about why stress hits gay male professionals differently. This pattern shows up differently depending on your field, but the underlying dynamic is awfully consistent. Let's look first at physicians and medical professionals, about hierarchy, burnout, and the cost of control. So let's define the category accurately: physicians, surgeons, psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, nurses, and technicians. Medicine is not just a profession, it's a hierarchical, high-stakes ecosystem with its own internal culture and status structure and psychological demands. Everyone working in it knows this, even if it's rarely said out loud. Surgeons are often treated as the rock stars, sometimes with a level of authority and even entitlement sometimes that affects the entire team dynamic. Emergency room physicians and staff operate in a fast-paced, adrenaline-driven environment where decisions are immediate and consequences are high. ICU teams are repeatedly exposed to death and loss and the emotional aftermath for the families of the patient. Oncologists and cancer care teams are engaged in one of the most relentless and psychologically taxing battles in medicine. I heard a lot about this during the COVID pandemic, where there was a relentless pressure that kind of came and then subsided as the pandemic did, but it was a tough time. And regardless of specialty, there are some shared systemic pressures, administrative and insurance constraints that can distort how care is delivered, productivity expectations that can conflict with clinical judgment. I've heard this a lot from physicians I've worked with who are in private practices, and you'd think they'd have some autonomy in a private practice, but then they have a practice manager breathing down their neck and making unreasonable demands as if it's a low-level employee at a drugstore or something. There are political and cultural interference in medicine, public health debates, the anti-vaccine movement, which is driving physicians crazy. There's a media distortion and social media misinformation about whether it's vaccines or trans kids or medical care for trans adults. There's this cultural and political interference in things that should be about medicine and well-being between provider and patient. There can be competition among providers who may be doing very similar work and often in the same institutions. I've seen a lot with my own doctors about how they kind of have rivalries going on, and it sometimes ends up in the best care, but it also can be a little bit of a stressful environment because it's competition, especially in HIV, about who can do a better job, and it was really a race. Advancement that depends not just on competence, but on navigating complex institutional hierarchies and personalities, and not just skills and competence and credentials, but also about politics in a medical office or a hospital. So over time, this environment shapes how medical professionals function psychologically. It rewards control and composure and decisiveness and emotional containment. And so those are necessary traits in medicine. They work professionally, but they come at a cost, because the same qualities that allow you to function effectively in a hospital or any clinical setting can begin to narrow your emotional range outside of it, particularly in relationships or intimacy and your own internal life. And now let's add the gay layer to that. And this is where the experience diverges in ways that are often under-recognized even within the profession itself. So for many gay men in medicine, there is an additional ongoing calculation happening in the background. How visible am I here really? How much of my personal life do I disclose or not disclose, depending on the environment? Do I fit into the dominant culture of this department, or am I managing my way around it? Even in progressive cities, many medical environments retain a traditionally structured, implicitly heteronormative culture, especially in certain specialties or leadership tiers. So while you're managing clinical responsibility, hierarchy, and performance, you may also be modulating how you present yourself socially with colleagues, navigating subtle differences in how you're included or not included in professional camaraderie, lacking the same built-in, socially reinforced personal structure that many straight colleagues rely on. And then there's the internal side. Medicine doesn't leave much room for processing your own experience. So add to that a personal life that may be less conventional or less externally supported, such as maybe in a throuple or something like that. A dating or relationship landscape that requires more effort and intentionality. And the cumulative impact of years spent prioritizing training and career development and professional identity over any other thing in your life. So often what I see is not a dramatic breakdown, it's something quieter and more persistent. It can be emotional isolation, even when you're surrounded by colleagues. It can be a difficulty transitioning out of clinical mode and into a personal or relational presence. Relationships that don't fully take hold or they don't sustain. Or a sense that life outside of work feels less developed than it should be at this age, because you've had your nose in a book for the first 25 or 30 years of your life. So let's look at what's actually different. A straight physician in many cases moves within a system that reinforces both their professional and their personal identity in parallel. A gay physician often does not have that same alignment. Instead, there can be a split: high competence, authority, clarity at work, and then ongoing negotiation around identity and intimacy and belonging outside of it. And that split doesn't resolve simply with time and good income and professional success. This is the part that's easy to overlook. The more competent you are professionally, the easier it is to compensate for this imbalance without actually resolving it. You can function at a very high level for a very long time while something important remains underdeveloped or unaddressed. So why this matters and where the work comes in. Most medical professionals I work with are not lacking insight. These are often very, very, especially bright guys. They have to be in medicine. They were probably straight A students. And they already know that they're stressed, their relationships aren't where they want them to be, or something feels imbalanced. But insight doesn't automatically translate into life change, especially in a field that reinforces doing, performing, and managing, rather than stepping back and restructuring patterns. So what actually helps is more targeted, creating a deliberate transition between professional functioning and personal life, expanding your emotional range beyond what the job requires, addressing relational patterns directly rather than hoping they resolve on their own, integrating identity in a way that reduces the need for constant self-monitoring or adaptation. Because without that kind of intentional work, what tends to happen is collapse, not continuation. You keep going, you keep performing, you keep managing, and the personal side of life remains something, you get to later. And that's sometimes what I help medical professionals do. That would respond to both therapy and coaching, just in different ways. Let's look now at lawyers, attorneys, adversarial thinking, and the erosion of emotional flexibility. Law trains you very effectively to challenge everything, argue relentlessly, anticipate opposition, and control outcomes wherever possible. And in many legal environments, if you're not doing that, you're not seen as sharp and competitive or effective and profitable. And over time, that becomes more than a skill set. It becomes a way of thinking, again, that worldview, and often a way of just being. The problem is that mindset doesn't turn off when you leave work. Layer onto that the structural realities of the profession, billable hour pressure that quietly rewards overwork. Ethical dilemmas. How far do you go to defend or prosecute or negotiate? Repeated exposure to conflict, dishonesty, and the more adversarial aspects of human behavior. A career path that for many leads to burnout or significant midlife reevaluation. I've worked with a lot of guys at midlife who are lawyers, and they're wanting to do a career change in their 40s. So much of legal work places you in an ongoing David versus Goliath dynamics, whether you're protecting institutions or advocating for individuals against them. And that has a psychological impact. You become highly skilled at identifying weaknesses, anticipating attack, and maintaining control under pressure. So now let's add the gay layer. For many gay male attorneys, the same strengths don't stay confined to the courtroom or the negotiation table. They follow you home. Intimacy can begin to feel like another arena where you need to stay sharp. Conversations can take on a subtle argument structure even when connection is what's needed for a partner. Vulnerability can register almost automatically as a loss of position or leverage. At the same time, many gay men don't have default relationship structures to fall back on. So instead of relaxing into connection, you may find yourself evaluating potential partners rather than engaging with them, maintaining control rather than allowing mutual influence, achieving professionally while feeling increasingly uncertain about personal fulfillment. And let's look at where this starts to show up. This doesn't usually look dramatic at first. It shows up as relationships that feel effortful or they're short-lived, or dating that becomes overly selective and analytical and disengaged, or a sense that you're good at your career but less effective in your personal life, like in relationships or dating. And by midlife, many attorneys I've worked with arrive at a quieter but more destabilizing realization. I know how to win cases, but I'm less sure I know how to build a life that I actually want to be in. And that's not a failure of intelligence, it's the predictable result of applying a professional operating system to areas of life where it doesn't translate well and often just works against you. So I did a previous episode on gay men and breakups, several of them. If you go to gaytherapyla.com/blog and search on breakups, I spoke about some things where it's not a dramatic ending, but it's a repeated difficulty sustaining connection under pressure. And that's a relationship breakup risk. Now let's talk about teachers and professors with visibility and risk and the politics, oh boy, of identity. Education used to be primarily about knowledge, building knowledge and building knowledge put into practice, which is called skills. Now it's a lot about optics and politics and risk management, often at the same time. For many educators, especially at the K through 12 and university levels, the role has expanded beyond teaching into something more exposed, more scrutinized, more evaluated, and in some cases more precarious. Gay educators, in particular, are navigating pressures that straight colleagues often don't have to think about in the same way. A photo in a swimsuit at the beach can be reframed as evidence of impropriety if it circulates in the wrong context. If a student finds it and says, oh, look, this is Mr. So-and-so in a revealing bathing suit. Nothing wrong with that. But in some schools, especially K through 12, this can be seen as a scandal, falsely or not. There could be false or exaggerated accusations, sometimes retaliatory, like for disciplining a student or giving them a grade that they don't feel that they deserve. That's a real concern. Even if they ultimately don't hold up upon investigation, you still have to go through this process of defending yourself. I've had probably 3 guys that I've worked with experience this. It's a lot. And it has to do with generational issues about entitlement and a resistance to authority and asserting independence and emotional sensitivity. I hear a lot about these generational issues in my work, in a lot of different work settings, but especially in academia. Boundaries with students or even parents can be tested in ways that feel coercive or at times even overtly threatening. You give my kid an A or else I'll make your life miserable. That's extortion. And in today's broader cultural climate, those pressures are not occurring in a vacuum. LGBT educators have in some settings become symbolic targets in larger cultural debates, labeled sometimes by right-wing crazies as groomers, a deeply offensive and dangerous narrative that can legitimize suspicion or hostility or retaliation. States such as Florida or Texas and Tennessee, legislative and policy shifts, what we call black letter law, in different ways, have reinforced a climate where educators may feel increasingly monitored or constrained or politically exposed. Some university in Texas just did a ban on any LGBT content in student papers or in courses or in campus programs. Florida had the Don't Say Gay policy, where in K through 12, you can't say gay, you can't say transgender, you can't say anything in service to education about the sociology or the dynamics of the LGBT experience as children or adults. And at the same time, many educators are contending with a broader shift in how knowledge itself is regarded. Carl Sagan once warned, "We risk moving toward a culture where my ignorance is as good as your knowledge." There's a false equivalency there. We see that with the vaccine controversy going back to medical providers, where there's this false equalization that bad science or rumor or hearsay or just junk is somehow seen as on an equal footing of legitimacy as rigorous science. Decades of rigorous science, especially about vaccine safety. So for teachers and professors, this is not just theoretical stuff. It shows up in classrooms at all levels of education and in parent-teacher conferences or interactions and in institutional decision-making at the highest levels, deans and department chairs and principals. So now if we add the gay experience within that already complex environment, being a gay educator often means operating with an additional layer of awareness, not necessarily dramatic, but constant. Hypervigilance about self-presentation, both in and out of the classroom. Careful calibration about what is disclosed or implied or left unsaid. Emotional labor that goes beyond teaching, managing perception, anticipating reactions, maintaining professionalism under scrutiny, feeling self-conscious about life even outside the classroom or on social media. And perhaps most significantly, there's this tension between visibility and vulnerability. Being visible can feel important, even necessary, especially for students who may benefit from representation. But being vulnerable or simply being human in an unguarded way can feel risky in a way that straight colleagues don't have to calculate as frequently. So over time, this doesn't result in a single breaking point necessarily, although I have seen educators leave the field of education over some of these stressors. But it kind of accumulates. There's a baseline level of guardedness that doesn't fully turn off. Fatigue from managing not just the work, but how you are perceived doing the work. A sense that you're carrying more than your role description actually reflects. And like in other professions, many gay educators reach a point where they're not questioning their competence, they're questioning the sustainability of how long they're living and working. How long can I put up with this crap? I hear that from educators sometimes. Not because they don't care about the work, about being a teacher and delivering the curriculum and educating usually young people, but because the personal cost of maintaining it as it's currently structured in a lot of areas of the country, really all when you think about it, starts to become clearer over time. Let's talk now about corporate or startup and creative professionals. There's reinvention, image, and instability. In Los Angeles, or Southern California especially, many gay men work in overlapping worlds. There's entertainment, such as writers, directors, producers, designers. Corporate leadership and high-level management in the corporate world. Startups, building something from nothing, often under intense pressure, long workdays, long weeks. I've heard a lot of examples of this from gay male entrepreneurs who sometimes it pays off very, very handsomely, which is why they do it. But it takes blood, sweat, and tears to create something out of nothing. And these environments look very different on the surface, but psychologically, they share a common structure because they're all driven by constant reinvention. What worked last year may not work now. Image management and personal branding, not just what you do, but how you're perceived. Almost like everybody needs a publicist these days. Financial variability, especially in startups and creative fields where income and stability can fluctuate, especially if you're a freelance worker. A high comparison culture where you're continuously measuring yourself against others who are also ambitious and visible and often highly accomplished. There's very little resting state in these environments. And over time, that makes it difficult to feel grounded anywhere. You're either advancing or you feel like you're falling behind. Now, if we add the gay layer to that, for many gay men, these professional dynamics intersect directly with identity in a way that is more immediate and more personal than in some other fields. Appearance and desirability can become entangled with professional visibility, especially in industries where image carries currency. Networking often blurs into social and at times sexual dynamics, making it harder to clearly separate personal boundaries from professional opportunity. Social circles and professional circles frequently overlap, which can intensify both connection and comparison. And underneath that, there's also often a persistent question of, am I valued for what I do or for how I'm perceived? And that ambiguity can be difficult to resolve. In LA, especially, I think, in Southern California, and for gay men, appearance can be a big factor. Appearance privilege, and not just for actors or models or news reporters, people in the public eye, but appearance and desirability can influence professional skills that are not related to appearance. So that can be a challenge. There's been a discussion in 1960 with the election that was happening between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon that it was the first televised debate, and Richard Nixon sweated under the television lights, and John F. Kennedy didn't. He literally appeared cooler and more collected and better looking. He was a younger, better looking man. And people have said, did that influence the election? Is that why Kennedy won? I mean, in addition to all the ideas and all the campaign platform, but was that a thing? Because he sweat less? What does that have to do with being president? It's definitely been discussed over the years. And where this starts to show up, what I often see in my practice is not a lack of success, but a lack of felt stability. So even when things are going well, success can feel provisional, dependent on momentum rather than secure footing. Self-worth can fluctuate with visibility and intention or external validation. Our self-esteem rises and falls on the smiles and frowns of others, is a phrase. Relationships can become secondary or intermittent or difficult to sustain amid constant movement and constant demand of the professional role undermining the personal roles. It can be a sense of being on, professionally, socially, even physically, without a clear place where that performance finally turns off. And over time, that leads to a quieter kind of strain, not burnout in the traditional sense, but a persistent feeling that your life is externally driven rather than internally anchored within your sense of self. So what's different for gay men across these professions? Across all these professions, and others too probably, the same underlying pattern shows up. Areas of personal development that were delayed or interrupted in early life, a persistent gap between performance and authenticity, increasing isolation as professional demands narrow time and connection, and a parallel pressure around appearance and desirability that doesn't exist in the same way for straight men. It's starting to. There's starting to be, look at the glow-up movement of the youngins on social media, or the looks-maxing phenomenon that's younger, often straight men. A number of years ago, the metrosexual straight guys that wanted to be on a par of gay men who knew how to do good grooming and fashion. So individually, each of these challenges is manageable. Combined and layered onto already demanding careers, they create a situation where you can function at a high level professionally while something important in your personal life remains unresolved. I've seen extremes of this. The times when, say, I've worked with a guy who's a gay man, but in the public eye or has some very, very big position, and I admire these guys a lot. Some of them are very well known, but personally, there's some issues in their personal life, despite being dramatically accomplished professionally. So, what do you do about it? People sometimes describe the problem and then leave you with vague advice like, oh, be more aware or set better boundaries. That's a bit cookie cutter in the therapy and coaching world, and it's just not enough. Because if awareness alone were going to change this, it already would have. So let's be more direct. I want to give you some ideas about what you do about this. So many blogs and podcasts and seminars and self-help books, they do a great job of describing problems, but they don't do quite as much about, but what do I do about that? Where's the relief? Where's the respite? So let's be more direct with some. Number one is stop relying on insight alone. Most of the men I work with already understand themselves pretty well. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not that insight is translating into different relationship choices, different communication patterns, different responses under stress, and different decisions about how you use your time and energy. And also different ways of thinking, in cognitive therapy especially, about how are you framing yourself and situations. Because if those aren't changing, then insight, no matter how accurate, isn't being applied. And that's where people stay stuck. Just recently, I had an episode about when a gay man's career feels at risk with false accusations and workplace anxiety. And it was based on several guys I've worked with who have faced false accusations in the workplace and had a great amount of anxiety having to defend themselves against a perception that they were absolutely not guilty of. So you might want to hear that episode as well. And that's where professional pressures and identity collide. Number two is build a structured approach to change. What I mean is change doesn't happen through intention alone. That saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But it requires structure, clear, deliberate focus in the areas that actually move things forward. So targeted emotional work, not endless processing, but working directly with repeating patterns emotionally and behaviorally. Behavioral shifts. You change how you date or set boundaries or handle discomfort and respond to stress in real time, not just understanding it after the fact. Identity integration, reducing the gap between who you are across different contexts. The subtitle of my book from 2013, Self-Empowerment, Have the Life You Want, is how to close the gap between where you are and where you would like to be in different domains of life. Your health, your mental health, your relationships, your sex life, your finances, and your community. So without that structure, most people revert under pressure to just what they already know, the sometimes default neurotic setting. And this is where most men realize they've been thinking about the problem for years without actually changing how they move through it. It's familiar, but it's not necessarily malleable. So number three is address your career stage, not just career stress. So this isn't just a stress management issue. It's about where you are in your life and your career and what that stage requires now. Your needs at 30 are not the same needs that you have at 50 or 65. And if you don't adjust, you end up applying outdated strategies and expectations of yourself to a different phase of life. So early career, it's about identity and confidence and setting a direction for yourself, embarking on climbing the mountain or climbing the corporate ladder. Midlife starts to address a burnout risk, a little bit of self-reflection and reassessment of where you've been and where you're going, in life in general, but especially in your career. It can also be a time of relationship depth. Midlife is often a time when guys might have been in a relationship for a long time now. In your late career, there are concerns about, how do I leave a legacy? How do I matter after I'm not here doing what I'm doing anymore? It might involve an increased value in mentoring and feeling like you're giving to the new generation. And what will have meaning in your work? What is the legacy of your profession beyond just a university naming a building after you if you give enough donation? And then, of course, there's post-career, purpose beyond your status when you don't have a business card anymore because you're retired. And we'll do more about retirement later. Ignoring these transitions is one of the main reasons that things start to feel off, even when life looks successful on the surface. I work a lot with guys developmentally. If you reach out for a consultation, probably one of the first questions I'm going to ask after just your name is how old you are, because that tells me a lot about where you are developmentally and what challenges you're likely to have, and maybe more important, what kinds of resources and solutions are likely to be effective for you. Number 4 is use therapy or coaching strategically, sometimes one or the other, sometimes both. And this is where a more deliberate approach makes the difference. Therapy and coaching are not necessarily all that interchangeable. There's legal and ethical aspects of that on a legal and ethical level. But when they're used well, they address different parts of the same system. Therapy often involves looking at your patterns, your emotional blocks, your relational dynamics, some of how did you get to where you are now, for better or for worse, the challenges and the supports, even the privileges sometimes. And coaching is a lot about life direction and making important decisions and forward movement. Therapy can be about forward movement also. I've heard coaches who are not therapists sometimes say, therapy is about drudging through the rubble of the past, and it's all about navel gazing in the past. That's not really true, or that coaching is about focusing on the future and building a better life. Both of them are about building a better life. They just do it in slightly different ways, and I can explain more about that when we talk. There's strengths and limitations, I think, to each form of professional service. For many high-functioning men, the issue isn't intelligence or motivation. It's trying to solve complex patterns in thinking and behavior with the same self-directed strategies that worked elsewhere. And to be clear, you don't need years of vague, open-ended exploration. What tends to work is focused, intelligent collaboration, work that respects your level of sophistication while directly addressing the patterns that keep repeating that you don't like very much. Because once those patterns are engaged directly, things tend to move, often more quickly than expected. Let's talk about why this work actually improves your life. When both types of work, therapy or coaching, are done well, the results aren't just abstract. They can be subjective. Oh, I just feel better. But they're often the first indication for many men that something can actually change. They show up in ways that you can feel and in ways that other people around you begin to notice. Reduced stress and burnout, not because your job became any easier or any different, but because you're no longer carrying the same internal friction alongside it. Increased emotional range and flexibility. You're not locked into one mode, and you can respond more effectively across different situations. Better relationships, romantic, social, sexual, not just more activity, but more stability and more depth and less repetition of the same unsatisfying patterns. When I work with couples, I see that, where there's a lot of repeating of patterns that don't work. It's like a recurring dream where you have to kind of change the point where you wake up from the recurring dream, especially around communication. You can have clearer career decisions. You evaluate the opportunities in your life based on what actually fits your mind, your values, your personality, rather than just reacting out of pressure or fear or habit. and a stronger, more integrated sense of self, less compartmentalization, less self-monitoring, and more consistency across contexts. And these aren't dramatic overnight transformations, but they're shifts in how you operate internally and externally, the relationship with yourself and with others. And that can accumulate over time and begin to change the trajectory of your life. In other words, your internal life starts to match the level of competence that you already bring to everything else. And for many high functioning men, that alignment is what's been missing, sometimes for longer than they even realize. And the cost of not addressing these things or minimizing them or pushing them off, it's not because guys don't see it, but because for a long time they continue to function well enough, good enough is good enough, without addressing it directly. But over time, the patterns don't stay contained. If you don't address some of these things, stress can become more chronic, not acute or situational, but a baseline you begin to normalize. And then stress has the opportunity to affect your mental and your physical health and your relationships as it becomes more entrenched, untreated. Relationships can stay superficial or inconsistent or difficult to sustain or just unsatisfying, even when you want something more stable. Or your career satisfaction suddenly declines, not because you're failing, you're doing your job, but because the work alone no longer feels like enough in your value system. And life begins to narrow. You take fewer risks or fewer new connections and more repetition of the same routines, the grind, which is an accumulation. A stressor at the beginning, might be more easy to handle than a stressor that's been repeated over and over and over again for a long time. And the most important part of this, I think, is this doesn't happen really in a dramatic or an obvious way as an event. It's a process. And sometimes without even a clear breaking point. It happens gradually over years while everything on the surface still appears to be working. And that's exactly why it's so easy to lose more time than you intended. So there's a particular kind of frustration I see in accomplished gay men. I've done everything right, so why doesn't this part of my life work? And it's not a failure of effort. You're capable of probably unusual effort among people. And it's not a lack of intelligence. These guys are often very bright, especially so. But it's a signal that strategies that worked in your professional life are not translating in the same way to your personal life, and may even be working against you there. And once you see that clearly, the question shifts not from what's wrong with me to what would actually need to change for this part of my life to work differently. A phrase I've heard is, what would I have to do or believe or just allow for my life to change? And that's not a question most people can answer on their own, at least not in a way that leads to consistent change, behavioral change over time. By the time many men reach this point, they've already spent years trying to think their way through it. Most of the men I work with wish that they addressed some of these things earlier, just at an earlier age. And this is where a more structured and experienced approach makes the difference. At a certain point, continuing to think this through on your own stops being productive and just becomes kind of reflective and ruminatory. And it starts costing you precious time in life that you don't get back. So if you're recognizing yourself in this, you're not starting from scratch. You're likely dealing with patterns that haven't changed, not because you haven't tried, but because they haven't been addressed in a structured and targeted way. And that's the work that I do. I work with gay men who are already functioning at a high level, but who also want their personal lives and relationships and a sense of direction to match that. So I offer therapy for gay men in California via telehealth on Zoom, and coaching for gay men nationwide in other states or cities, and sometimes worldwide. We just figure out the time zone difference, which can be challenging. So to schedule your free 15-minute consultation, call or text. Text is often faster. 310-339-5778. 310-339-5778. Or just email me, ken@gaytherapyla.com. or ken at gaycoachingla.com. Both of those will reach me. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please let me know and spread the word if you think that there's a gay male friend or colleague who might benefit from hearing this. And as always with podcasts, a review or rating always helps to get the word out about the show. So thanks, and I'll see you next time.